Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, the podcast where narrative meets design and every story lives at the edge of interactivity. Today we're joined by Jesse Scoble, a narrative designer, writer, and world builder with experience across AAA games, tabletop role-playing games, and most recently, comics. You might know Jesse from his work on Assassin's Creed Origins, Far Cry 5, Hyperscape, or from his work on City of Heroes and Wizard 101. He's also written short fiction, established new IPs, and contributed to the intersection of story and systems for over 2 decades. In this episode, we're digging into something rich and complex. What happens to a story when it jumps mediums? Now, transmedia storytelling is a topic we've covered a lot of ground with on this show, but it's always compelling to get a fresh perspective, and Jesse's current work with his comic endeavor offers us a rare peek at the process. So let's get into it. Jesse, thank you for joining me.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks.
I'm excited to get a chance to talk with you. I've been hounding you for a little while now, but we're going to talk today about a topic I've mulled through before, and I love the topic of transmedia storytelling, and I want to get your take on it as you break off into doing some comics work, and we're going to talk about the comic you've got coming out. But before we get into it, I like to set the stage with your origin story. How did you fall in love with gaming, board game, tabletop, video games? How'd you get into writing? And then a brief, your career highlights. Who is Jesse today?
It is an excellent question, one that I ask myself pretty much every morning. I do a lot of panels at various cons, and I also often start with that question for the panelists. I used to listen to the Creative Screenwriting podcast with Jeff Goldblum. A lot. Look his name up later. Was always really impressed by hearing the different stories, how screenwriters would get into it, how everyone's story, I mean, there were similarities occasionally, but almost every story was unique. And so, I was thinking of this a little bit. My kind of canned response to this question is a car accident, which is true, but is also very short, not very informative. A longer answer. I guess if I go, all the way back to sort of high school, and is when I sort of got into pen and paper games and role playing games. I had initially, I think a number of folks had some vague conscious of what D&D was, even at an earlier age. I had the Red Box. I had the AD&D Monster Manual and the second one, but it wasn't until high school. Or I guess, the beginning of high school, where I was starting to read the Dragonlance novels, that I met a group of kids who had done it, who knew what they were doing more or less, and invited me into the group. And that gave me my kind of first taste of role playing, figuring out how the rules actually worked, and the game system, the collaborative storytelling. And then towards the end of high school, I had, two things. So one, I had joined the Ottawa University Games Club, which was a very welcoming, very warm, very safe environment, I guess is a way to say it. I was a high school kid. I mean, I started at 10th grade, hanging out with these university students, doing board gaming, miniature gaming, role-playing and stuff. And around that period, 10th, 11th grade, somewhere in there, I started GMing. And I had tried it once before with my original kind of group where I had lived in Boston before I moved to Ottawa. And had gone disastrously wrong. It was a terrible, one of those, oh my God, nobody's listening to me. I can't keep them focused. This is horrible. Why would I ever do this again? But tried it again, had a much better, more receptive, group, a little bit older. I guess I had a little better sense of what I was doing. Even though I was one of the younger people in the group, I mostly hung out with slightly older high school kids than these university folks. And I started GMing quite a lot. I became one of the main GMs of our group. And so around that time, so I was doing that on the gaming university club front. And then I had done a creative assignment for an English class in Ontario at the time. We went to grade 13. So it was a grade 13 English class, which probably, if I could find, would be shamelessly copied from an Alan Moore story or something. I know it was heavily influenced. I mean, it's probably, more than I would like to admit now. And I don't even really remember what the topic of it was, but it was some kind of sort of dystopian apocalyptica thing. And I had been out sick for a couple of days, and the teacher read my story to the class, which was fine, whatever. Came back, and people who I didn't really know, I didn't really associate with, came up and complimented me. They said they really enjoyed it. And that was a very weird, people kind of breaking the cliques sort of to kind of convey that expression. And that was really the first sort of taste of, there could be a greater audience than just the kids around my gaming table. So anyways, that's a lot of kind of backstory, but it's stuff I don't normally kind of talk about in this. It's cool. So again, sort of roughly in that same period, the Amber Diceless role-playing game came out, and I remember it being advertised in Dragon magazine, and I thought, what is a diceless role-playing game? That sounds super cool. So I was able to get a copy at the local store, started reading through it, realized I had read a little bit of the Amber Chronicle, Zelazny's Amber Chronicles, and thought, these are cool. I really should go find the rest of these before I read the rest of this rule book and all the spoilers. So as I was kind of tracking them down and starting up my own Amber game, there was a co-op student from the University of Guelph who came into Ottawa for a semester who was looking for an Amber game of all things. And I think I was the only person in town who had ever ordered the Amber book from the local gaming store. So they basically said to me, they said, hey, there's this dude who posted up a sign looking for an Amber game. You should call him. He looks like he needs friends. So I did. I thought, okay, well, what the hell? Give this a shot. And he ended up becoming an incredibly good friend. This was Mark McKinnon, who, when I then went to the University of Guelph, in part because I knew about it because of Mark and some of his friends. Mark was in the chemistry program, very different from me. I mean, I went to English Lit, but we did a lot of gaming at that point in time. And towards the end of my university career, Mark was a few years older, he started his own game company. He was one of these guys who was always very entrepreneurial, very, always making board games, whatever. And he created a rules light RPG that was sort of in the vein of GURPS, but much more streamlined and simpler, based heavily on a bunch of anime that he had recently gotten into. And that became the basis for Big Eye Small Mouth, the first the first game of what became Guardians of Order. And Guardians of Order, weirdly, was the title of his character in my Amber game. It became the name of his company. So he started doing it full time, thought he liked it much more than the chemistry degree. I finished my degree and I kind of thought, I'm going to put my childish things away. I'm going to grow up and go away from gaming and do whatever anybody does with an English degree, like be a journalist or a waiter or one of those things. Yeah. And so I left Guelph. I gave him my stuff. I ended up starting a road trip across North America. And in the middle of Pennsylvania, I crashed my car. And we can talk about it some other time, but nobody was hurt other than the car. I had a big dog with me at the time who was not impressed by my driving. But we kind of limped back to the greater Toronto area. And I ended up back in Guelph because I knew people there. There was a room I could rent for cheap, figure out what I was going to do, kind of lick my wounds, get a new vehicle. And in the process of that, I ended up working for Mark for about 5 years. I started off as an office manager for Guardians of Order, packaging up things, mailing them out. And then he said, hey, you've got some writing background, you like to run games. Do you want to write, part of a book for me? So I did the El Hazard, the world character stuff on the El Hazard role-playing game. Was my first real writing credit in that level. And when those books came back from the printer, I mean, there's a long delay, right, of when you ship something off and it finally comes back. There was this sort of heady rush of like, oh, this is pretty cool to see, my name in print, to see stuff I had worked on. So that led me into basically 5 years of working in the pen and paper game space. So I did. Althazard was the really only real anime game I worked on. I wasn't as into that at the time. But a lot of people had been using the best in rules for superhero games. So we ended up doing a superhero game spinoff called Silver Age Sentinels, where I don't know if you know Lucien Solban, but Lucia's a longtime video game writer and RPG writer. He came to Guelph for a year as a creative director and was basically my mentor for a year, which was fantastic. Funnily enough, he lives in Montreal, where I now am, and we have reconnected, many times over the years. but he really kind of helped shape me as a writer and as a narrative person. So we did Silver Sentinels. Then we got the rights to do a Game of Thrones. We did the first Game of Thrones RPG with George Martin, and that was a fantastic experience. But unfortunately, lots of forces were against the company at that point, and it ended up shutting down. And I was able to transition at that stage through definitely hard work, but also definitely a dose of luck to working in the video game space. And I ended up moving from Toronto down to Austin, Texas for a year to work as the community writer for City of Heroes at NCSoft. So I did a lot of lore, website stuff. Did that for a year, came back to Canada, worked at Webkins for 2.5 years, the Toys to Life product. Met some fantastic people in the Toronto area there. And then strangely enough, I ended up going back to Texas to work on Wizard 101 with the guys at King's Isle and with another couple folks, Jason Durrell and Todd Coleman, who again helped sort of bring me to the next level of professionalism, of development, of learning how to work at a bigger game studio, really do game design work with all levels of the team. And that was fantastic. I mean, in a lot of ways that was sort of the place where I feel I really kind of earned my spurs. I don't know what Texas metaphor, or earn my wand, I guess. Anyway, but it was great. It was really, I was there for about 3.5, 4 years on the team. Got to touch pretty much every part of the game over the different updates and things. And then we came back to back north, back to Canada. Ended up in Montreal, where I worked at Ubisoft Montreal for 5 years on a couple of big projects like 2 of the Assassin's Creed games, a little bit on Far Cry. I ended up leading the Hyperscape team, which we'll, I'm sure, come back to because it ties a lot with what we're going to talk about. So that was fantastic. 5 years there. And then did a few years at Tencent as a small kind of project. I have recently landed with lovely folks at Beamdog, an Edmonton-based studio, and where I'm happily working right now.
Wonderful. Beamdog is close to home for me here, so yeah, that's one of our hometown heroes.
Yeah, they're great guys.
Wow, that's quite the journey. That's and it's a much longer story than Crashed a Car.
I figured I'd give you the full one this time around, and then we can,
I appreciate it. That's great. It's a great story. That's good. And it sets the stage really well because it illustrates how many different things you've worked on and the variety of platforms. And that kind of leads us into the whole transmedia storytelling. I guess writing for so many different platforms and storytelling formats, I guess to start us off, to kind of set the stage for us, how do you pick which part stays the same when you're jumping around? Let's start with voice, for instance. How do you make the narrative's voice stay the same when you're jumping between media?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of 2 ways to answer that. One is, what is my own voice, as I think you're kind of getting at.
Yep.
What is the thing about me that I bring to it? And I think, I rely a lot on some of my foundational, I don't know, hero is the right word, but formative writers, right? I mentioned Roger Zelazny. I will constantly go back to, in particular, the Amber Chronicles, but some of his other writing is fantastic as well. He was a new wave American science fiction author.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other folks who I find like their paths kind of crisscrossed with him. Folks like Harlan Ellison, somewhat more recently, Joe Michael Straczynski, like his work on Babylon 5, I found it just foundational at the point where I was, really absorbing all of this stuff in high school and university. And I guess there's an age, there's a part where your brain is just more of a sponge with these things, that those formative years, and there were a ton of Marvel comics, Vertigo comics, all of these things that kind of intersected, and they created this, not one world, but all these interconnected worlds. But there's a lot of common themes that I'll often fall back on and try to find a way to use that within the construct of what is appropriate to that particular I'll use the word IP, but that world, that the universe that I'm working with.
Right.
So, the kind of eternal struggle between shadow and light, chaos and order, the sort of Moorcockian, Michael Moorcock's, Eternal Warrior stuff, right? A lot of these things that found, like, that built the foundations of the fantasy and science fiction genres that we continue to build on, and they have deeper, more mythic, more resonant origins. But that's where I sort of first encountered them, and where I kind of draw on them from. And then kind of beyond that, I take a look at what the property is, what the world, what the characters, what the story that I'm trying to tell is, and try to find a way to come up with things that sound, I know other guests in your show have talked about this before, but, immerse yourself in that, figure out what makes it sort of sound correct, sound appropriate, and try to find a way to leave both the part that is as most authentic, most true to it, but to bring, my angle, my lens to it, and merge those things.
That makes complete sense. And you're right. Yeah, we've touched on that, but I always like getting fresh perspectives, a different point of view. How do you handle these things that are so common when you're working with transmedia storytelling, that we all have some slightly different takes or insights or experiences? So I appreciate that.
It's interesting. There was a essay blog post that Richard Dansky, friend of the show, and I will probably come back to Rich, invoke him again, posted the other day, I think, on LinkedIn, talking about these major properties like Batman, and how, one Batman story does not invalidate, 50, 70 years of Batman stories. And when it comes to comic stuff, that is I automatically know that's like a core truth. Like, of course, these parts of, the X-Men are great. These parts I ignore. Nostalgia is remembering the stuff you liked and forgetting the stuff you did.
Right.
When it's something that's a sort of has a smaller amount of material, I think we can sometimes get too locked in. If there's a thing that only has 2 or 3 movies, for example, some property where one of them feels very discordant or strikes a wrong chord with everything. I mean, we're in a very entitled age, is one of the challenges of dealing with our audiences and things,
right? And
being an audience member as well. I feel frustrated when something does not do a good job as far as I am concerned of continuing that that world, that thing. But I think it's important what Rich said, about trying to remember, these things can exist together, but just because one entry in the canon or in the body of work doesn't work for you, it certainly doesn't take away the pleasure that the original stuff should have given you. And it gives a chance for different people to take a swing at it. It opens these things. I think there's certainly something for material where one writer, one or creative team or whatever controls it and wants to sort of honor a particular tone, particular voice, I think, a particular story. I think that's all very, very legit. But when it becomes something that's opened, that's more owned by a corporation, that's a bigger thing, you're going to get some sanding of the edge of those kind of sharp edges down, but also, there's a higher chance of failure, but also higher chance of reward by introducing it to people who would not have had a chance to work on that kind of thing otherwise.
Makes sense. Get fresh voices and fresh perspectives. But on the topic of canon, how do you tell what's sacred? How do you know what is, if you're writing a comic book based on, say, the Elder Scrolls, how do you know what part of that emotional experience and that narrative that's in the video games is sacred and has to be transferred into the comic? And where do you figure out when to adapt?
It's a good question. I think when it's something that has a huge, sprawling history, Assassin's Creed is maybe a good example. Part of it is you really hope that the people who own, control that world recognize the value and that it's important to be consistent, internally consistent, and have that sort of clarity of voice and vision, and that they have people who will help you do those things. And, Ubisoft is a good example of that, where, it's very good. They have a support network. You have, historians, you have people you can go back to try to make sure everything is copacetic. At the same time, that these big properties or whatever have many, many moving parts, many people dabbling in them. It's very hard to have a completely comprehensive knowledge of it. So you do your best in those cases. You try to, double check the Wikipedia pages. Sometimes the fans have a better, certainly when we were working on the Game of Thrones RPG, and this goes back to 2003, 2004. So there weren't a whole lot of internet resources. But what there was good. And I, for example, became super good friends with a couple of the people who run Westeros.org, Ellie and Linda, who had a good relationship with George Martin. But as you can probably imagine, Martin was not very available to answer, hundreds of questions of trying to build an RPG world, and how many, what kind of swords should the Baratheons have or whatever.
Right.
And Ellie and Linda were, for example, super hardcore fans that knew everything backwards and forwards. And so sometimes you think I think, why aren't they writing this thing? Like they're better placed to work on this project than I am. But sometimes you're lucky, or you have your own tools, your own, maybe I was better, or I like to think I was good at managing, the 15 writers we had working on that project. Right. And try to keep everything, kind of in check and whatever. But yeah, some of it is that. So you hope that if it's a big thing, that there are people that can help you safeguard it. I think you have to do your best to, find the threads that you like about the material, that you want to be, that you cherish and that excite you about it. Even if it's a contract gig where you're coming in as sort of a gun for hire, you may not love everything about the property, but part of the job is finding those things that you do really like about it and finding ways to polish them and enhance them, bring them forward, and try to, again, to find that voice where things fit within that context and it all kind of clicks. Again, sort of a narrative design, answer to that. When Game of Thrones, when we did the Game of Thrones game, there had been a couple of articles in some various, like when Dragon Magazine or whatever, trying to adapt Game of Thrones to D&D. And so, like, Stannis was Stannis Baratheon was a paladin in one description. And part of me can understand, okay, yes, I can see his relationship with the Red Woman as being sort of a paladin of the fire god, but it's not really the way he is depicted in the books. The books do not have magic the way D&D does. And so this is you're really shoehorning, the round peg into the square hole or whatever. Whereas if you're able to kind of deconstruct the concept of the classes and rebuild it in a different way and say, okay, well, no, these are actually abilities that support this kind of knight character class. I think it works better. It's more authentic to the property that you're trying to kind of capture. You're trying to deliver to the fans the thing that they want, the reason that they're coming to it. So I think that's part of a key part of it when you have that ability to kind of do those things.
Makes me wonder, when you try and fit narrative into a system, into mechanics, like tabletop role-playing games, it sounds like there's often situations where the system creates constraints that can impact the narrative. Does it go the other way? Do you ever write something for a system and it's the mechanics that influence the narrative or the story? Or, in your opinion, maybe you don't have an answer.
Well, yeah. So in Hyperscape, so Hyperscape was a battle royale. It was a sort of neo cyberpunk dystopian world. Everything is on fire. The news is worse every day. I know it's hard to imagine. And everyone escaped into their metaverse. Their what's the Gibsonian term? Anyway, their cyberspace.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that we developed it that way was I wanted a narrative support for a structure where you were fighting with these same people all the time and killing them, but nobody was dying. in a way where you could still have an excuse for these characters to reappear, to return, without it being completely thrown out the window. I mean, I wanted the world narrative to support that. And then one of the features we had in the game, so unlike a game like Overwatch, where the characters have specific powers, so everybody, all the champions in Hyperscape had basically the same stats. Nobody had special powers. Everyone could use all the weapons and whatever. But we had these power-ups that you could collect during the course of a match that would have variety, and depending which ones you found and got, would give you a different gameplay. And so we had been calling them hacks as an internal term, and that sort of just stuck. And said, okay, well, if these are hacks, they're being introduced in the game. Like, what does that mean? Like, why is the official game company creating hacks in their game? That's weird. I don't like that. So we kind of did a lot of thinking about it and said, okay, well, how can we introduce something in the narrative that helps justify this? And it ended up being a rogue AI, basically gets loose in the system and creates that. I don't know if it's the most original thing. It's not really. I mean, lots of things you can point to, but it worked. It was sufficient, and it allowed us build a lot of interesting things kind of off of that. We said, okay, well, now we have a reason why these people kind of keep returning, because they are just playing a game in their own world. We have these hacks introduced by rogue AI. Okay, well, the rogue AI is going to become the meta plot that all the characters are going to be interacting with or thinking about, and so it sort of expanded that way. Hades, I think, is personally my pinnacle of game that does narrative design tied into the mechanics, perfectly, right? The idea of a roguelike where you're going to die all the time and learn from it being built into the idea of the god of rebirth trying to escape hell. I mean, those are things that's like, man, that's so brilliant. I need one idea like that in my life.
You can learn a lot from studying how various games have tried to explain the respawn mechanic, like New World and how you're trapped in Eternium and you have to keep respawning, to games like Battle Royales where you're just respawning because it's part of the program, to some that just hand wave and say, hey, you just come back, forget about it. It's interesting just to see how they do handle that one single mechanic and how it impacts the narrative.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, you mentioned tabletop role-playing, and I wanted to get back to this question that I had in the back of my head. Tabletop is way more open and chaotic and free-forming, and in that case, when you're writing for that, when you're creating a world for that, doing narrative for that, how does the open world and the chaoticness inform how you approach the task of creating narrative in those games? That's what I meant.
So I think it depends what you're trying to build or create, right? So, for example, I've done a bit of work recently on the new Marvel multiverse RPG with Matt Forbeck. And the projects we worked on that are character guides or like the X-Men expansion where we're talking about Alpha Flight, for example, good Canadian heroes. So in a case like that, you're looking for interesting hooks that players and GMs can both grab onto and expand. And I don't have a good Alpha Flight example, but bear with. Whereas it's just, you try to dig up the interesting elements of how Department H, came about and how that could create avenues for players to create their own characters or to meet interesting NPCs or for there to be mysteries for the GM to explore, all that kind of thing. When you're working on something like my writing partner, I worked on a couple of chapters in their Cataclysm of Kang campaign book. It's a mouthful. And for the recent Avengers preview, we did the standalone free RPG adventure for that. When you're trying to design an adventure, that is, to me, one of the hardest parts of RPG tabletop writing, where you're trying to think of as many variables what players might do. How do you introduce this thing in a way that is interesting, is coherent, is easily accessible, that gets them into the action quickly, that gives them things to do, that leads them, kind of breadcrumbs them to the next major part of the story without putting them on a railroad, that is open to, tries to foresee where they might take it. And having, GM for, more of my life than the other part. You develop some instincts and how to do this, but even then, you go to a con or say you decide to run a game for, your 13-year-old and 4 of his buddies. Oh boy, they can take it right in ways you will never imagine. So when you're writing an adventure for an RPG, again, it's trying to figure out how much can you pad in, and and there's issues of word count and what you're being paid to do. So all of that are confining. So you try to kind of build the guardrails. You try to give as much guidance. You try to give sometimes what the essence is, like the theme we're trying to convey is this, or the bad guy's real plot is X, and so things should sort of move in that general direction. If the players get stumped, here are some ways to get them back, towards the light. So some of those tools are things you think about. Whereas in a video game, for good or ill, those are not things you generally need to worry about.
Right. But you still have to respect canon, even in tabletop. You still have to make Spider-Man, and the Hulk still has to be the Hulk, and you've got to stick to canon, right?
Yeah. If you're doing something that's an official project, for sure. If you're doing something that's a little bit more open, I haven't done anything for a while, I guess, out there. But I mean, I've done a couple of standalone like campaign worlds or whatever for friends projects, where I've been given a lot more freedom, where you're not so worried. There's not necessarily like whatever you're creating at that point is the canon, as opposed to working under a Marvel or a Game of Thrones type property.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, to bring us up more to date, what have you learned from working on tabletop and video games and creating inside of those media that you're now able to use in comics? Because you're working in comics now.
Yeah, it's both easier and harder.
Good answer.
I was talking to some family friends recently who are not in our industry. They they're not genre people. They'll occasionally go see a movie or something, right? But they're not in the hobby. And they said, "Oh, hey, you're doing this comic now. Well, you come from games, so now the easy thing is just to turn your comic into a game." I'm like, "Oh my God, shoot me!" Like the reason I want to work on a comic is because it's not a game. So the core difference, if you will, is that everything is my decision, and I'm going to define mine in a second, but on the comic, So the way the comic project came about is my writing partner, who he and I go back a long time, Devinder Thiara, he and I have done a ton of stuff over the years. And one of the things we have not been able to do before was work on a comic. And I said, I really, something we wanted to do for a long time. And things came to a point where I said, you know what, we have a little bit of a little bit of capital built up. So let's find an artist that we really like, and let's, pay that artist up front, and we'll experiment with this and see, what we can do here. And being able to control that process, being able to say, okay, yes, we are going to bring in, a production person. Okay, yes, we're going to have this person do the lettering. Okay, well, we want to do, something more experimental here. Let's bring in another person. Let's do this. Let's kind of control these elements. There's a lot more responsibility. I wasn't intending, I keep joking, I wasn't intending to create a business or create a company in doing this. I just wanted to, do the words and have someone do the art and then shop it around, but not having much of a name in that space means that we're kind of forging, the way every step of the way we're kind of forcing our way through, this terrain. And lots of people have done this before. So it's not like it's completely uncharted terrain, but you still have to figure a lot of it out for yourself. So, I've read a bazillion comics. I've worked in, related medias. I've read many movie scripts. I've written a couple of movie scripts, not that they have anything wrong with them, but at least kind of gone through the process. But some of it is there's a bit of a spectrum where on a video game, you can say a Western town and leave it at that. And the art department, the concept artist, the technical artist, the 3D artist, the all those folks, they'll figure that stuff out. If you have something that's important, there's a saloon, the bank looks like this, whatever. You can provide references, you can direct them, but they'll do a whole lot of the heavy lifting. In a novel, on the far this other kind of side of the spectrum, which all words is all on you. Well, you got to write what you got to, what's important. You need to, brush up on your Louis L'Amour or your Larry McMurtry or whatever. Pull up the sense and the tone and what things look like and so forth. So comics are a little bit in the middle where, depending on who the artist is, and we're very lucky with our artist Tomas Aira that he loves Westerns and he's super happy to research and to pull this stuff together. Because kind of working on a Western, so that it all kind of pulls in on that side. But we're still in the process of learning, how much action can happen on a page. That in a movie you could say, he punches the guy, or he, jumps on his horse and rides off, or whatever. And in a video game, you can, depending on how many assets you have, what your game engine, what your team is able to do. Sometimes that stuff's super easy. Sometimes it's incredibly impossible. You've got to kind of figure that out in every stage. Again, with the comic, it's trying to realign your thinking, kind of unlearn some muscle memory and build new skills and techniques and think, so if this is my, page of info that I want to get across, like every sort of beat is basically a panel unto itself, and how many bits of dialogue can we have going back and forth, and what's confusing, and where do we rewrite stuff when the art comes in and it's beautiful and we don't want to cover it up with words, but we still need to express this. How do we juggle all of these components? And there are some constraints where I have worked with certain folks who are beyond my pay grade, who are able to come in and basically tell a concept art team to like change this, change that, change the whole thing, throw it all out, start over again, whatever. It's nice work if you can get it right. So whereas because we are self-financing this project, that every kind of change has a cost to it, and Tomas is great and he's very accommodating, but there's a certain point where you kind of got to lock something and move on to the next part.
Right.
It's not as brutal as it was when at Ubisoft, when we were working on Hyperscape. We did a Transmedia comic for Hyperscape, and the timeline was brutal. You had to basically have the comic locked, I want to say 6 months before sort of the release date.
Wow. Whereas
in video games, I mean, quite often you're, depending on the team and the project, whatever, you're making changes, pretty much week to week or whatever. It's like, oh, this isn't working, we're going to completely redesign this, or oh, this is going to be the change for the update. Until it gets out there, anything can change, right? It shouldn't, but it can. So trying to juggle, those storylines, those characters, or whatever within it, like, so basically with Dark Horse, who are great partners, but they had a very tight, like, you have 3 days to, review our sketches and, or your script or whatever, and give us notes. And there's so much to hold in your head sometimes with some of these bigger projects that trying to keep everything there is just hard. And it's, so sometimes things slip, for example. So anyway, so those are some of the processes as we transition over. And again, sometimes trying to keep the whole story in your head. So Dev and I know what our comic story is because we wrote it as a movie script a bunch of years ago. And we're updating it and changing certain things, but they're key elements. So when we were doing the first issue, like, we were so in the staring at the trees, I guess, right? Kind of forgetting the 40,000 view of the forest. So we're trying to introduce one of the main characters, who's a newly appointed federal marshal. So, the character design is great and he's got the badge, it's all shiny and the art's basically done. And we start looking at our material to do the script for issue 2. And we're like, oh God, there's an actual reveal where he shows his badge, he pulls his badge out of like his luggage. I'm like, he's not supposed to be wearing in the first issue. How the hell did we miss that? And we're just so, right, face to the page. So that was a case where we're like, hey, Tomas, how hard would it be to change these 4 panels and put something in the way, and he's like, yeah, no, it's fine. That's easy. So sometimes you hit those moments where, so we're trying to get better about thinking ahead, thinking about what are we going to need down the road? How do we bring that in now? How do we foreshadow things? How do we properly position it? So that's all some of the challenges of that work. It draws from stuff we've done, but also, you're not worried about, you're not worried about a player, of course, because it's just basically prose or effectively. Yeah. And you're not worried about an editorial team. You're not worried about, not really worried about a test audience where, all of these people, rejected this premise and you must go back and add more, Coke or whatever to that. Anyway, so those are some of the elements.
Very, very cool. That's fascinating. The differences, and very cool. Well, let's bring the core topic to a close. I got some fun stuff for after, but just to kind of bring it all together and put a little bow on it. And I like to aim this kind of more at the narrative folks, the game writers, just because that seems to be the most of the people who listen to this. So why not give them something out of it? I guess if you were to come up with some advice to give to narrative teams, to narrative designers on how to approach storytelling that could in the future become transmedia. If you're making a new IP or you're writing for something and, there's whispers that, hey, we could have a comic, this might break off into a book series or something. What should they keep in mind?
So there are a couple of things. One of the things that I've heard said many times by people, again, who tend to be higher pay grade than me is, comics are a super quick and cheap way to develop a new IP, to test a new world. And I think that's true to a degree, but I think it's maybe not more directly expensive, but I think it's more work than people sometimes realize to do it properly. Mm-hmm. There is a difference in working with a comic artist, someone who can tell a story in through sequential art versus just concept artists or illustrators. And I've worked with some absolutely brilliant illustrators who I'm like, I would love to work with you in a comic. And they think, oh my God, that's just too much work. I'm never going to do that. That's awful.
Yeah.
And so there's overlap in that Venn diagram, but it is certainly not a circle. So having, I think the idea is fantastic, but it's in a case like that where you have company that might have support, they have to be clear and honest about what resources that would take in time and money and so forth to develop it properly and figure out what can you do with this. Right. Another element, and again, this seems incredibly obvious when I say it out loud, but I didn't realize it at the time, so hopefully it saves somebody else, is when trying to develop something that has a comic, again, just based on the deadlines, how long it takes to produce something, even if it's purely in-house, but certainly if you're working with an outside partner, like a Dark Horse or Oni or whatever, that you should silo it is the word I want to say. So, I mean, I don't know if Arcane, for example, had League of Legends, like where the overlap in development is, but I suspect that they're pretty separate. Yeah. And I mean, that's a huge, much more, gigantic undertaking, but trying to do a comic for Hyperscape that was concurrent with the timeline of the seasons of the game. So we would have you're already like, what? Are you crazy? Why would you ever think that would work, Jesse? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
I don't know. I don't know if I know that far, but it sounds very ambitious.
He's top there. So trying to have a comic that would sort of roughly come out with the seasonal updates that would advance the overall meta storyline, that would give you, character development, that would also perhaps highlight characters' new outfits because the marketing team wants to sell the cool, awesome new, gear. Oh my God, why the rest with, and then we also had, we worked on a couple of animated shorts, two of which are out there, the Ace one and the Tower one. Anyway, they were beautifully done. Those were a little easier because with those we went back to some of the shorts. So with Hyperscape, just to kind of explain this, because it was a battle royale that did not have quests, that did not have massive game logs. What we did to basically tell the story of the characters and develop it is you would find collectibles over the game map. And everyone you found would unlock a piece of flash fiction. So it was like a 2,000-word short story about one character or one element that would come with a wallpaper, a cool splash image, again, getting different artists to explore the characters and stuff. One of the things that we messed up in doing this is because the map would change from week to week. There was one point where there was a collectible on a bridge, and then the week after the bridge got blown up and there was no way to get the collectible. And I thought, oh my God, how did we, not foresee this? But I did. My safety net for that was at the end of the season, if there were any you hadn't collected, everyone would get them in their character background page or whatever. So that story was not locked away from people. They might not get the experience or whatever, but at least they'd be able to read the whole thing for the lore. Anyway, so the collectibles, and having so we drew from those in order to do the animated shorts. So we basically kind of took this 2,000-word short story and then, found the coolest sequence within it and said, okay, we're going to make this into our neat CG mini short thing. Yeah. So easier, not easy, but having that element to it. So, I mean, those are some of the things. So again, if you're doing stuff that, if you can tell prehistory of your world or something about a particular character, how they were before they got to the kind of beginning of the game, I think all that helps you deepen your world, your tapestry, that well to draw on without interfering with what's going to happen in gameplay. Because, we've had games where feel the game's done, goes to some review process, and they want to change everything. Or you have a sequence where you think, hey, chariot racing is awesome. We're going to have a chariot race through the town. And there's a whole bunch of cinematics that are all built around this. And then the designers are like, yeah, we can't make the chariot race work. The chariot keeps ending up on the rooftop of the building and then the town burns down. And so we're just going to pull that feature. So you don't want your transmedia element to be dependent on that, because, one of the truths of game design is that until it works and is shipped and is out there, you don't really know if it's going to work.
Good advice. On the topic of shorts, and just came to my mind, have you ever seen the Team Fortress 2 shorts, the character shorts? The Pyro one. Every time I'm thinking about revealing character through Transmedia, I always think of the Pyro video. It's a little glimpse into how his brain works that you would never, ever get any other way. It's so funny.
Yeah, and those things are fantastic tools, right? You have to have the support of the team, and they're very resource intensive, but it's great when you can pull something like that off or
So cool. All right. Well, that's the end of the core topic. Before we move into the outro stuff, but I have a philosophical question I ask everybody who comes on the show, and I'm sure you've probably heard it a couple times, but it's your turn. I'm going to ask you the question. In my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of story and game, obviously, but also comic books, improv, television, film, novels, all these things, where the people involved can just get together. There's a fellowship, there's a shared language. There's this magical thing that happens there. If you agree with my little theory, not everybody does, but if you do, what's the magical thread that would hold a space like that together?
I want to see outtakes of all the people who disagree with this question, disagree with your theory.
There was only one, and it's not outtake. I left it in, and if you're curious where it is, it's Mark Gaston, the Final Fantasy guy, or fighting fantasy guy.
So, I guess not outtake, but when you get a bunch of them, you should string them all together as a.
Mark is the only guy, and Mark, he disagreed, and then he had a fantastic answer, so it was still good.
So I've heard a number of people talk about community, and I think that's a part of it. I think for me to answer it, I would look at where imagination and creativity and passion all sort of come together, because I think that's part of what drives this kind of work, this kind of enjoyment. And there are people who, come into it from different sides, right? There are certain artists who say they could never write and they are, are envious of the writing. And I'm always like, come on, the writing is the simple part. I can't draw like that, or I can't, I don't know the technical tools like that, or I can't do, awesome voices like that. But when we're excited about these fantastical worlds and ideas and exploration, and they're not, by no means, they're not just escapism, right? I mean, often it's lenses with which we look at ourselves and the things that we are wrestling with. And you find those things that excite you, and then you build a community. Because, one thing I've noticed about people often is if you give an excuse for them to come together, they often will, and you can create those bonds, and you can bond over, the stupidest. Often we bond over, tragedy and misfortune, right? Or even difficulties. Like, it doesn't even have to be misfortune. You miss an airplane and you're stuck, sharing a limo or whatever, sharing a ride, or shuttle to the hotel where they're, putting you up, for 3 hours or something, and you're complaining about it. You kind of bond with those people who are going through that, that misery at the same point. But anyway, but if we find something that's exciting to bond over, elves or dwarves, or, how elves hate dwarves, that gives that sort of support, and that, because the flip side of humanity is we're also super quick to point someone else out as the other and the enemy. And that's the unfortunate part of it. So if we are able to find that excitement over these shared, cool, imaginative, worlds, and I think that helps us develop empathy and potentially respect and kindness for other people. I think that's, that ultimately, I mean, that's lofty, but ultimately that's, I think, where we aspire to.
Yep, I agree. I love that. That's a great answer. That is a great answer. Thank you, Jesse. Well, we're going to start heading for the door. I do like to open up some space right around here for signal boosting. And normally I'm like, I don't know what you're doing. What's going on? But I know what you're up to. So why don't you tell us all about the thing that you're working on, where we can find it, where we can find you online if you want us to follow you, all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So the past year, Devinder, Fiara, and I have been working on Dead Money with Tomas Ida, and as well as support by Mishka DeCaro and Julieta Ladstatter, Chris Miles, and Adam Jury. Lots of names there. But that's the small core team we've pulled together to create this comic. So Dev and I wrote this as a movie script a lifetime ago. I realized we don't really know how to make movies, but figured we could try this as a comic. And so we got together with Tomas, did the first issue, decided that there was something there, that we liked it, brought it out on Kickstarter this summer. And we were very lucky to have support from lots of friends and family and people sharing it. So the first issue, got funded. We're kind of locked and loaded. It's actually just off to the press right now. We're just reviewing proofs as we get started on the second and third issue of the series. And it's a black and white Western horror comic that I loftily describe as Aliens meets Tombstone, or Pitch Black meets The Thing, something in that vein. Cool. Actually, I should have been Pitch Black meets Unforgiven, or Deadwood meets The Thing, because Pitch Black and The Thing are too overlapping there. But anyway, so that's the big endeavor, and the Kickstarter's done, but we're going to be up on BackerKit and Drive Through Comics soon, and I'll give you the info for that to post in the notes. Yep. And then we haven't really talked about, but the other thing I have coming out, I hope soon, we're trying to get all the production side done, is I am putting out my first novel this year, I'm going to say. Possibly early in the next year. Anyway, we'll see how it comes together. It is an esports novel, so it's a near science fiction, a near future story about a competitive gamer and their world and the highs and lows, and be very excited to talk about that down the road. But that's the other main project.
Well, I'm going to have you come back and talk about novel writing now too, as well.
Fantastic, love to.
I don't know if we should or not, but should we mention Beamdog, Myth Force? Is there anything happening there?
The folks are great. Lots of exciting things. So cool. You'd be amazed. Nothing I can talk about.
Right on. That's, I'm very familiar with that phrase, so it's all good. Well, my friend, I think that is it. I guess I'm going to push you out the door here, but as you head out the door, do you have any parting words of wisdom for us? This could be life. It could be craft. It could be a drink recipe. Just give you the last word.
I think we need in these days to find solace in art, in creating it or enjoying it, taking some time to connect with those who are important to us. I think we have to keep our guard up and keep an eye on you know, everything else out there. But I think it's important to take some time for yourself to stay kind of focused and centered, and try not to get too consumed by the darkness. So that's what I'm going to leave you with.
And that wraps up another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Jesse, thank you for guiding us through the spaces between player agency, authorial intent, and the wild transmedia ride that is modern storytelling. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. If you found this episode interesting, please leave a comment, a like, subscribe, and hey, come join us over on Discord and get in on the conversation. Until next time, keep telling stories, playing games, and creating worlds worth getting lost in. Stay safe out there, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.